Imagine being born into a world gripped by instability, a world where chaos often reigns, and where survival itself seems like an unending struggle. This was the world of Thomas Hobbes, a man whose life would unfold during one of the most tumultuous periods in English history, the English Civil War. A man of deep introspection and acute awareness, Hobbes was not merely a bystander in this era of crisis, but rather a keen observer and interpreter of the forces shaping it. In the violence of civil war, the breakdown of social order, and the rise of competing political ideologies, Hobbes sought answers to questions that have haunted humankind for millennia. What is the nature of human beings? What is the best way to organize society, and who should wield power? What makes us human, and what prevents us from destroying each other? Through his philosophical inquiries, Hobbes crafted ideas that would not only become cornerstones of political philosophy but also shape modern views on human nature, the structure of society, and the role of the state. His most famous work, Leviathan, remains a foundational text for understanding the relationship between individuals and the state. But behind the pages of theory lies a remarkable human story, one of a philosopher grappling with the dangers of his time, a man who lived through wars, upheavals, and shifts of political power. His insights into human nature and political order still resonate today because they spring from the struggles and experiences of a life lived in uncertain times. Hobbes's journey was more than a mere intellectual pursuit, it was a response to the human condition itself. His life and ideas challenge us to confront our own assumptions about authority, freedom, and the very nature of human society. The lessons we learn from Hobbes are not just those of a thinker in a library, but those of a man observing the fray, struggling to piece together a vision for peace amidst chaos. Early life, a world in upheaval. Thomas Hobbes was born on April 5, 1588, in the small market town of Malmesbury in Wiltshire, England, to a relatively humble family. His father, a vicar, was often absent from the household due to his clerical duties, leaving Hobbes in the care of his mother. While the village itself was quiet, the world around it was anything but. Hobbes was born during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, a time when England was at the height of its power, with military victories over the Spanish Armada providing a sense of national pride. However, this stability was deceiving. Beneath the surface, religious tensions were simmering, and there were political factions vying for power. The seeds of conflict were already planted. Hobbes's own life would be shaped by this turbulent political landscape, one where authority was contested and the very foundations of government were questioned. When Hobbes was still a child, his world was rocked by one of the most defining events of his early life, his father's violent and untimely departure. Hobbes's father became embroiled in a dispute that escalated into a physical altercation, leading to his flight from the town. This incident would have left a young Hobbes with a sense of instability and fear, setting the stage for his later philosophical explorations into the necessity of order. Amidst this chaos, Hobbes developed an early interest in learning. His mother, a devout woman, focused on his education, and Hobbes demonstrated an impressive aptitude for language and the classics. By the time he was a teenager, he had developed a proficiency in Latin and Greek, languages that would serve as his entry points into the vast world of philosophy and literature. At the age of 14, Hobbes left his hometown for the prestigious Magdalen Hall at Oxford University. Oxford, steeped in intellectual tradition, exposed Hobbes to the thinkers and ideas that would shape his later writings. However, the education he received at Oxford was not the type that encouraged independent or scientific thought. Instead, he was schooled in the classical scholasticism of Aristotle, which emphasized reasoning based on established religious doctrines. Despite this conservative approach to education, Hobbes quickly realized that much of the world's knowledge was still clouded by dogma, and began to yearn for a more scientific and empirical approach to understanding the world. The intellectual climate of Oxford, in many ways, prepared Hobbes for the seismic intellectual and political shifts that would occur during his lifetime. But it was not just philosophy that grabbed his attention. Hobbes also became interested in mathematics, particularly the works of Galileo Galilei. This interest in the sciences, alongside his philosophical education, would come to influence Hobbes's belief that human behavior could be understood not just through abstract reasoning but through measurable, observable principles. Education, the seeds of doubt. At Oxford, Hobbes was introduced to the classical works of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. Yet, despite the scholarly reverence for these figures, Hobbes found himself increasingly dissatisfied with the answers they offered. His intense curiosity about the natural world and the mechanics of the universe led him to gravitate toward newer scientific theories. The Renaissance and the early rise of scientific inquiry were beginning to spread their influence, and Hobbes found the theories of Galileo, Copernicus, and others intriguing. Unlike the philosophical debates of the ancient world, these new ideas were grounded in observation, measurement, and experimentation. In the 17th century, England was in the midst of profound intellectual change. The scientific revolution was gathering momentum, and new discoveries were challenging the established view of the world. Hobbes began to see a new paradigm, one that promised to replace the ancient view of human nature with a more empirical, mechanistic understanding. This was the beginning of Hobbes's belief in the idea of the materialist view of the universe, that everything, including human thought and action, could be understood as a function of physical matter in motion. The experience at Oxford also exposed Hobbes to the tensions brewing in English society. England was moving towards political crisis. As tensions between King Charles I and Parliament reached their breaking point, Hobbes was forced to confront the broader consequences of these divisions. The intellectual environment of Oxford, with its insistence on abstract reasoning and theological explanations, could not prepare him for the real-world conflicts that were about to unfold. But this exposure to competing political and religious forces would later shape Hobbes's thinking on the importance of a strong, centralized authority. Though he absorbed much from his studies, it was during this period that Hobbes's personal philosophy began to crystallize. He came to believe that the only way to resolve the chaos of human life and human society was through order, through the imposition of structure and law. What he encountered in the political upheavals of the time was a perfect illustration of how human beings, without a common sense of law and governance, devolve into conflict. Hobbes's own experience of growing up in a country on the brink of civil war, coupled with the intellectual climate of skepticism about religious and political structures, led him toward a view of humanity that was far darker than that of many of his contemporaries. He saw people not as naturally inclined to cooperate, but as driven by fear, desire, and self-interest. The English Civil War, a crisis of order. The English Civil War, which erupted in 1642, was a cataclysmic event that shaped the trajectory of Hobbes's career. The war was fought between the Royalists, who supported King Charles I, and the Parliamentarians, who sought greater control over the monarchy. It was a struggle for power, a battle over the control of the state, and a conflict that divided families and nations. It was also a time of extreme violence and destruction, leaving much of England's infrastructure and economy in ruin. For Hobbes, the war served as a terrifying confirmation of his pessimistic view of human nature. His first-hand experiences of the chaos were deeply unsettling. Hobbes, who had been a strong supporter of monarchy, found himself in exile in France after the Royalist defeat. During this period of exile, Hobbes wrote extensively, attempting to make sense of the catastrophic events that had unfolded in his home country. The war reinforced Hobbes's belief in the necessity of a strong central authority. He saw the violence, the betrayal, and the sheer instability of the time as evidence that, without a governing power to enforce laws and maintain peace, human beings were doomed to conflict. Hobbes's experiences of civil war in England led him to formulate his most famous political theory, the state of nature. In this state, where no government or social structure exists, humans would live in a constant state of fear and aggression, governed by the instincts of self-preservation. Hobbes's philosophy was not merely theoretical, it was a direct response to the horrors he had witnessed. He believed that to escape this state of constant fear, humans had to give up certain freedoms and submit to a higher power, one capable of enforcing laws and ensuring peace. This power, in Hobbes's vision, was the sovereign, the Leviathan. Leviathan, the social contract and the nature of men. Hobbes's Leviathan, first published in 1651, is a work of profound importance in the field of political philosophy. In this book, Hobbes laid out his theory of human nature and the structure of society. He famously described the life of humans in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In the absence of a common power to enforce laws, Hobbes argued, life would descend into a violent struggle for resources and survival. To avoid this, Hobbes proposed that individuals enter into a social contract, an agreement to give up certain freedoms in exchange for security. By agreeing to obey a sovereign power, whether a monarch or an assembly, citizens would be protected from the dangers of anarchy. This sovereign, Hobbes argued, would have absolute power to make laws, levy taxes, and maintain order. The legitimacy of this sovereign was not based on the consent of the governed, but rather on the necessity of creating and maintaining peace. Hobbes's vision was radical in its implications. It justified absolute monarchy, rejecting the popular notions of consent and representation that were gaining traction in Europe at the time. But for Hobbes, this was not a matter of ideology, it was a matter of survival. In a world where war and violence seemed to be the natural state of humanity, Hobbes believed that only a strong, centralized authority could provide the peace necessary for society to function. Hobbes's ideas about human nature and politics were not universally accepted. Many contemporaries, particularly those in the parliamentary camp, rejected his vision of absolute authority. But Hobbes's work would go on to influence thinkers like Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and later political theorists who would grapple with questions about the balance between individual liberty and state power. Later life, the philosopher in exile. After the publication of Leviathan, Hobbes's life settled into a quiet rhythm of writing and intellectual engagement. Though he was now an established philosopher, his work was not without controversy. His theories on politics, human nature, and religion were criticized by both royalists and parliamentarians. His advocacy for absolute monarchy made him a target for those who believed in the rights of individuals or the importance of parliamentary democracy. Hobbes spent much of his later life in France, where he continued to write and engage with other intellectuals. Though Leviathan had brought him fame, it also made him a target of criticism. He remained steadfast in his beliefs, despite the personal and intellectual attacks. The context of Hobbes's thought, the rise of early modern philosophy. Before diving into Hobbes's specific contributions to political philosophy, it's important to understand the intellectual context in which he was writing. The early modern period, beginning in the late 16th century, marked a seismic shift in how humanity understood the world, both externally and internally. This period was characterized by the rise of scientific inquiry, the questioning of religious dogma, and a re-examination of the role of reason in human life. Hobbes, like many of his contemporaries, was greatly influenced by the changing intellectual landscape. The works of Renaissance humanists, the Copernican revolution in astronomy, and the early theories of Galileo and Kepler helped pave the way for a new, more empirical view of the universe. These developments had a profound impact on Hobbes's thinking, especially his belief that human beings and their actions could be understood through the principles of physics and materialism. This shift towards scientific and mathematical methods of inquiry led thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, and later, Leibniz, to explore metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology in new ways. Hobbes's distinctive contribution to early modern thought was to apply the emerging scientific paradigm to political theory. While philosophers such as Descartes sought to understand the nature of the mind and the metaphysical basis of knowledge, Hobbes sought to understand the mechanisms of human behavior and how they might be regulated through rational systems of governance. In this broader intellectual context, Hobbes's ideas were revolutionary, particularly his belief that human beings were, at their core, driven by material desires that could be studied and understood in the same way as physical phenomena. This mechanical view of human nature set Hobbes apart from many of his contemporaries who believed in a more spiritual, rationalist view of human beings. Hobbes's materialism and the foundations of human nature. One of the most fundamental aspects of Hobbes's philosophy is his belief in materialism, that everything in the universe, including human thoughts and actions, is made up of matter and motion. This stands in stark contrast to the dualism of René Descartes, who famously divided the world into the material and the immaterial, the body and the mind. For Hobbes, however, even thoughts, emotions, and actions could be explained by the laws of physics. In his work De Civ. 1642, and Leviathan, 1651, Hobbes elaborated on this materialistic view of human nature. He argued that all human beings are driven by two basic impulses, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. These are not abstract moral considerations, but rather physical, sensory experiences that can be analyzed and understood. According to Hobbes, our desires, fears, and decisions are all the result of sensory input and the internal motions of our bodies. This makes human beings, in Hobbes's view, no different from any other material object in the universe, governed by the same principles of cause and effect. The implications of this view were vast. If human beings were nothing more than complex machines, governed by mechanical laws, then political systems could, and should, be constructed in the same way that machines are built, for efficiency and stability. Just as a clock requires a watchmaker to function properly, so too, Hobbes argued, society requires a powerful ruler, the sovereign, to keep everything in order. Hobbes's materialism also had implications for ethics and morality. In his view, concepts like good and evil were not absolute, but were instead relative to an individual's desires. Good was whatever promoted one's self-preservation and desires, while evil was that which hindered these goals. This naturalistic view of ethics would later influence Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume, who also rejected the idea of inherent moral truths in favor of a more empirical and consequentialist understanding of morality. The social contract, a path to stability or a recipe for tyranny. One of Hobbes's most famous contributions to political philosophy is his theory of the social contract. In A State of Nature, Hobbes argued, people act according to their self-interests, driven by the fear of death, desire for power, and pursuit of comfort. However, this constant conflict results in what he describes as the war of all against all. In such a situation, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this chaotic state, Hobbes argued, individuals must enter into a social contract, where they collectively agree to surrender certain freedoms in exchange for security. the individuals form a commonwealth under the rule of a sovereign who has absolute power to maintain peace and order. This sovereign, once established, has the right to enforce laws, levy taxes, and even control the military. The sovereignty of this ruler, whether monarch or assembly, cannot be questioned or overthrown without returning to the state of nature. Hobbes's social contract theory was groundbreaking in its emphasis on security as the primary function of government. Unlike later theorists like John Locke, who emphasized the protection of natural rights, Hobbes was less concerned with individual liberties than with the creation of a stable social order. The state, for Hobbes, was a necessary evil. It was not established to grant freedom, but to prevent anarchy. This theory, however, has been subject to critique over the centuries. Critics of Hobbes's theory often argue that his vision of the social contract leads to a form of totalitarianism, where the sovereign's power is absolute and unchecked. The very idea of surrendering individual freedom to such an extent raises questions about the morality and fairness of Hobbes's model. However, Hobbes's goal was not to endorse tyranny but to provide a rationale for why absolute authority might be necessary to avoid the far greater tyranny of civil war and disorder. Hobbes and the role of religion in politics. Hobbes's ideas about the relationship between religion and politics were just as revolutionary as his political theories. In Leviathan, Hobbes argued that religion must be subordinated to the authority of the sovereign. This was a direct challenge to the religious leaders and institutions that often held significant power in his time. Hobbes was concerned that competing religious authorities could lead to civil unrest and weaken the sovereign's ability to maintain order. Hobbes's perspective on religion was deeply materialist. He viewed religious belief not as divine revelation but as a product of human psychology. According to Hobbes, religious beliefs arose from human fear and the need for explanation in the face of the unknown. Since humans are driven by fear, they create gods and divine laws to explain and alleviate their existential anxieties. For Hobbes, the sovereign must have control over religious matters in order to prevent factions and religious strife. In Leviathan, Hobbes writes, "The sovereign power is not only the chief civil power but also the chief religious power." By placing religious authority under the control of the sovereign, Hobbes hoped to eliminate the potential for religious conflict and promote social stability. This was a controversial stance at the time, particularly as the religious divisions between Catholics and Protestants were a central factor in the ongoing conflicts in Europe. Hobbes's views on religion laid the groundwork for later secular thinkers, such as Thomas Jefferson and John Locke, who advocated for the separation of church and state. Hobbes and the enduring question of sovereignty. One of the central questions in political philosophy that Hobbes grapples with is the nature of sovereignty. What makes a ruler legitimate? How much power should a ruler have? How can rulers maintain authority while also ensuring the well-being of their subjects? Hobbes believed that sovereignty could not be divided or contested. The sovereign, once chosen, must have absolute power to create laws and enforce them. This was in stark contrast to the emerging ideas of parliamentary democracy that were beginning to take root in England during Hobbes's lifetime. While Locke and Montesquieu would later argue for a separation of powers, Hobbes maintained that only a single, undivided authority could effectively prevent civil war. Hobbes's conception of sovereignty is most often associated with the idea of the Leviathan, an artificial person with absolute power. But it's also worth noting that Hobbes's theory of sovereignty was dynamic. It depended on the ongoing consent of the governed to maintain its legitimacy. Although Hobbes did not believe in democratic government, he understood the importance of the people's willingness to obey the sovereign for the system to work. Without this tacit consent, the sovereign would lose its legitimacy and risk falling into anarchy. Hobbes's legacy, lessons for modern political thought. While Hobbes's views were considered radical in his time, his ideas have continued to resonate and evolve in modern political philosophy. The notion of the social contract, the relationship between the individual and the state, and the analysis of human nature as self-interested and driven by fear remain fundamental to discussions of governance, law, and authority. In the modern context, Hobbes's work raises important questions about the balance between security and liberty, the role of the state in regulating the lives of individuals, and the nature of political authority. Hobbes's stark vision of the state of nature and his advocacy for strong, centralized power have informed the development of both authoritarian and democratic theories. In times of crisis, whether in the form of war, economic collapse, or societal instability, Hobbes's call for a powerful, decisive government resonates with those who believe in the necessity of order above all else. Conclusion: the philosopher who strived for order in a chaotic world. Thomas Hobbes's life and work remain essential to understanding the philosophical underpinnings of modern political systems. His experiences in a world fraught with war, political turmoil, and social unrest led him to develop theories that prioritize security, order, and stability. In many ways, Hobbes's ideas continue to speak to us today, as we confront the perennial challenge of balancing individual freedoms with the need for collective security. In a world that often seems to be on the brink of chaos, Hobbes's reminder that humans are, at their core, driven by fear, self-interest, and the need for security offers us both a sobering reality and a call to action. For Hobbes, the pursuit of peace and order was not an abstract ideal, but a pressing necessity, a lesson that remains relevant to us all.